Well, I appreciate everybody letting me share some information. That I've been gathering this for a little less than 10 years now, and have rediscovered some things that we in Central Virginia had forgotten about, and so it's been fun to do that. I live in Missouri now, but I'm a Central Virginia native, and this has been a passion for me doing some of this research. So as John said, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and Larry will deal with those, and I will get started. So first thing, not a shameless plug because I don't make anything off of either of these, but most of the information I'm sharing with you tonight comes from one or both of these publications that I was involved with. One is the History of Tudelo Lodge book that was put out in 2015. I think about 250 of them were run, and the Trading Post might have a couple left. So if you are interested in that, you can contact the Tudelo Lodge Trading Post people. Also, I did an article for the Lynch's Ferry magazine, which is a local journal of history in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I think back issues of that are available for order from lynchesferry.com if you're interested in seeing hard copies of any of the photos or anything like that. Yeah, I was thinking when I was putting this together that it's one thing to write this, put this research together for people in the local area or scouts in the local area, but really the story is not that dissimilar all across the country. I mean, everybody has similar camp formation stories, and the pictures may look remarkably similar, but I'll share the Central Virginia story with you, and maybe there will be some parallels, and maybe there won't be. So as y'all know, scouting in the United States started in 1910. The first troop in Lynchburg was established in 1914. That was obviously Troop 1. Some of these all these boys here are in Troop 1. I don't know if they were getting ready for the train robbing merit badge or what, but they're a pretty tough looking group, I think. Obviously getting ready to go on a hike, or they just came back from a hike. Scouting in the Lynchburg area was founded by a man named Frank C. Wood, who you see to the right there. He was 23 years old when he left Washington, D.C. and came to Lynchburg to be the city's director of playgrounds. That was a big push at the time, was to have localities sponsoring recreation departments and other things, and so he was part of that. He had been involved in scouting in DC, and I think worked with the council there, and was the assistant superintendent of playgrounds there for the city of Washington. I think he was also the director of Camp Archibald Butt on the Chesapeake Bay. So he had some scouting experience before he came to Lynchburg, and passed that along. The council itself was chartered in 1920, and I think that's pretty typical, as you'll have local grassroots movements that form troops, and then eventually, when there are enough troops, the community decides that a council should be formed. So in 1920, the Lynchburg Council, or Lynchburg Area Council, was formed. The first camp that the council had was actually held in 1920. It was called the Piney River Camp, and was located in Nelson County, Virginia, which is between Lynchburg and Charlottesville along the US 29 corridor. The Piney River Camp is one that I am still looking for the exact site of, but it was basically in an area called Woodson in Nelson County, in what is now today George Washington National Forest. And it ran for 1 year. The scouts would take a train part of the way, and then a bus the rest of the way to get into that camp. But in 1921, a more permanent, more traditional camp was set up in the community of Pleasant View in Amherst County. And this is a photo of some of the Sibley tents lined up there at Sunset Camp. The land was borrowed, as I think many scout camps were during that time. It was on the west side of the Pedlar, P-E-D-L-A-R River there in Amherst County. And it was a fairly easy drive for scouts to get there from the city. They would take a bus that would get them to the local community, and then they would hike about a mile and a half in to get to the camp. I have a really cool story about actually finding this field, finding, even before I found this photograph, finding the field where this camp was held. That's a whole nother presentation for a whole nother time, but it combined all kinds of layers of research to come together to actually stand on the site where the camp was held. It was pretty special. So the camp began in June of 1921. About 30 boys went for the first week. Here is a collection of the scouts. They're coming back from a hike on the Peddler River. This is, what does it say, August 1922. This is the kitchen. This kitchen building could be moved around, and in fact was packed up and moved to the next camp that they held after 1924. And then there was a dining tent you see to the right there. So the dining tent had some screen around it, and then some open areas as well. In an effort to create an even more permanent, long-lasting camp experience for the scouts in Lynchburg, they went to another site in Nelson County, one county north of the Amherst County site. And actually, I made a mistake there. Sunset Camp ran from 1921 to 23. By the way, I have no, I don't know what insignia, if any, was issued for Sunset Camp. Always looking for information on that if anybody knows anything. But in 1924, the Lynchburg Council set up a camp at Tye Brook, which is near the community of Colleen in Nelson County, Virginia. If you travel the US 29 corridor between, say, North Carolina and DC or Baltimore, you may know Colleen because there's a really good ice cream place there. It's a pretty famous landmark in the area. Tye Brook is named that because the house that there is a historic home attached to the property called Tye Brook. The camp was on the Tye River, and it was on borrowed property borrowed from the Saunders family. The Saunders family still operates Saunders Brothers Orchard and farm stand there on that property. So you can go there today to buy some apples or apple butter or apple cider. And you can also see in their store, you can see photographs of the camp that they passed down through the family. This silk screened belt here is one of the Camp Tye Brook insignia. This one's from the mid to late 1930s. And the photo here is obviously it says headquarters, but it's the headquarters and trading post building for the camp. This is the parade field. You see that headquarters building in the back. And then the waterfront there on the left. They used the Tye River itself as the waterfront. That would become a problem for them eventually. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In this case, this photo of the waterfront shows that they're just using the river itself. They had not dammed it up yet, but they eventually did build a dam on the river to give them a larger waterfront area. This is a photo of that larger area. It's taken from across the river looking towards the camp. So they had a series of docks that ran out into the river. And then you see the lifeguard stand and other things. I don't often find really old photographs of camp buildings under construction. So I really liked this one. This is the dining hall at Camp Tye Brook. It's being built, I think, around 1926. And, it's being built from scratch by stick built with the lumber that some of it, I understand, they cut off of the property and milled nearby. This is the inside of the dining hall, and I wish I could read. I expect this is a camp song over here, written on the wall. Can't read it though, but it's a neat photo of the inside of the dining hall. two photos of what they call the shacks. I think most camps probably call these shacks rather than cabins. It just depends on the terminology of the area, though. But pretty typical for scout camps of the day to not use tents, in my experience. But if they had a semi-permanent camp set up, they would build these shacks that would have a 3 to 4 foot wall, and then typically it would be screened in, but sometimes open as well. Kind of a band around to provide insulation, not insulation, but ventilation instead. This is probably some sort of a camp award pennant here. I obviously can't see anything of that other than that it is a pennant. Some of the memorabilia paperwork from the camp. Tye Brook had this neat had this logo with the hatchet. This is off of one of their brochures. And then they used a rubber stamp on most all the merit badge cards that came out of the camp. This is a 1938 belt that I've only seen one of these in another collector's collection. I will note that this is the camp where Ne-Pah-Win Lodge number 161 was founded in the summer of 1939. In June of 1939, there were 5 scouts tapped out at the camp to be inducted into the lodge. Some oral history in the area suggests that Ne-Pah-Win Lodge number 3 may have been known as Pamunkey Lodge number 3 at the time, but they were also kind of inactive. That some members of Lodge 3 may have come over to conduct the induction for Ne-Pah-Win Lodge 161, but I have no documentation of that whatsoever. It's just oral history. This is the area by the early 1930s. Lynchburg Council had grown to include more than just the area around the small to medium-sized city of Lynchburg, and so it included these counties in South Central Virginia, and the communities of Livingston and Nelson County, Bedford in Bedford County, Danville, South Boston, Farmville, Chase City, and Crewe. The eastern half of that council would end up splitting off when the council merged in 1972. Those eastern counties would go to the Richmond Council, to what is now Heart of Virginia. The western counties would end up going to the Roanoke Council, which is Blue Ridge Mountains Council. So for the most part, all of the camps that we're talking about today were in this part of the area, which was where the initial population center of the council was before they expanded to Danville, and it shifted it somewhat south. So I should mention that around 1940, you might recall that I said that having the waterfront on the Tye River became problematic for the council. And the reason for that is that there was a mineral extraction company upstream called American Cyanamid Corporation. They ended up putting a lot of particulates into the water. Whether those were chemically dangerous for the scouts or not, it made the water constantly cloudy, and the council didn't feel that they could operate a safe waterfront there. In order to, it wasn't a safe place for the lifeguards to do their jobs. And so they obviously couldn't fix that problem. So they ended up looking for other places to hold camp. So during the first part of the war years, from 1941 to 43, a camp was I was going to say built, but it was really using an existing camp that had been abandoned, but they called it Lock Mountain. It was near a place called Eagle Eyrie. If you're familiar with the Virginia area, you might know Eagle Eyrie as a Baptist convention center, conference center, which it still is today. This camp was not part of that facility, but it was about a half a mile away. So in the same general area, in Bedford County, Virginia, just west of the city of Lynchburg. As far as I know, they only produced one patch for that camp. And that's one example is this flocked felt that you see below. For 1942, they scratched out, or they actually removed, chipped off the number 1 there from 1941 and wrote in 2 with a pen. And I haven't seen what they did for 43. I don't know if they made a new one or if they just altered some more of the 1941 ones. From 44 and 45, the council used the Holiday Lake 4-H camp in Appomattox County, Virginia. They called it Tall Pine Scout Camp. Looking at these photos, I think you can see why they might have called it Tall Pine Scout Camp. The Holiday Lake 4-H camp was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was a relatively new property at the time. The council found that it was a good place to hold a camp while they were looking for a permanent location that they could actually own land to run a camp on. This patch to the left is not confirmed to be from Piedmont Area Council Tall Pine Scout Camp. But for the 1944-45 period, I have found no other camps in the country that called themselves Tall Pine Scout Camp. This is the only patch that says this that I have found as well. So it is in my collection speculatively at this point as a representative example of that camp. 1944, the camp actually was not held. They had to cancel it about a week before because of a polio outbreak. Again, this is all about learning. So if anyone has other information about this, I'd be happy to receive it. I am aware of Tall Pine Council in the upper Midwest, but they weren't calling their camp Tall Pine Scout Camp. I put a little footnote down here at the bottom. After 1945, from 46 to 47, the council used a church camp at Park Springs, North Carolina, as their council camp. I have no real other information on that. If anybody in North Carolina knows more about Piedmont Area Council in Lynchburg using that property, I'd love to hear about it. I should probably also mention that there is oftentimes confusion about the name Piedmont Area Council. There is a Piedmont Council in North Carolina and a Piedmont Council in California. The Piedmont Area Council, when it is spelled out in that way, is the Lynchburg one. But there are oftentimes confusion about that name. So you'll see a lot of patches listed online for one council or the other, and the seller often has it wrong. During this time, there were a number of segregated camps that were held. They were all, they were on a mix of scout property and other types of property as well. So in the late 1930s, the council operated what they call Camp Bolton Smith. It was basically a rebranded Camp Tye Brook. It was staffed by all the Camp Tye Brook staff. It was just held on a different week, a separate week. But they called it Camp Bolton Smith. Bolton Smith was a business person from Tennessee who was very involved in African American scouting and the promotion of that at the time. And I do not know whether he donated any money for this camp or why it was named after him, but would love to know more about that connection. Following that in 1942-43, the African American scouts in the Lynchburg area went to a place called Camp Winona in Appomattox. Winona was actually built as a girls' camp, and it was built by Mozella Price, who was a very, very well-known, respected teacher in the Appomattox area. There's a school named after her there now, but she ran this house out of her home. That house is still standing just east of the town of Appomattox along US 460. And then in 1944, the scouts were intended to go to Green Pastures, which is in the National Forest near Clifton Forge, Virginia. The same polio outbreak that canceled Tall Pine Scout Camp also canceled the Green Pastures camp out. But that property has since been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was known as a safe, welcoming recreation area for African Americans for several decades during the mid-20th century. So the council finally found in 1947 or so, they finally found the property that was going to be their, what the term today would be, forever home, right? They looked at over 200 sites for a year and a half. And I'm sorry, in December of 46, the council purchased almost 400-acre tract in Nelson County, Virginia, near the community of Nelly's Ford, from this particular family, the Shoemakers. They called it a Williamsburg style farmhouse that was on the site. What they really meant was it was a late colonial, early Republic period, circa maybe 1790, 1800 house on the site. And the council decided to use that as a temporary dining hall and administration building. But they immediately drew up plans to build a new dining hall, a health lodge, caretaker's house, and 10 troop campsites. This is a plat of the property. If you are familiar with Wintergreen Ski Resort, Wintergreen is up this mountain here. And actually Wintergreen now owns all of this land, including Camp Monacan, and I'll talk about that in a few more slides. But the camp is located here, just west of US 151, the road that runs down here in the lower right corner, the lower southeast. They built a lake because most scout camps need a place to swim, and lakes are certainly more controllable than rivers. So they built what they call Deer Lake, and here are some photos from the construction of that. The camp was dedicated in July of 1948. They opened it in August, so they opened late that year for a camp. But they did have a number of facilities in place at that point. It wasn't completed, but they had a dining hall, the caretaker's cottage, the waterfront, and 4 of the troop campsites ready to go. So they operated for 2 weeks in August of that first year. And the OA, which at that time was still called Ne-Pah-Win Lodge, number 161, held elections and inductions there both weeks. This felt over to the right is the only year that this felt was used, 1948. They called it Piedmont Scout Reservation. It was the only year they called it that before they named the property officially Camp Monacan. The next year, in 1949, they had the first multi-year camp patch. And it's an odd patch because you have this mountain here. This mountain is the mountain I showed you on the topo map. That's pretty obvious. It's called Crawford Mountain. But these 2 dead trees were a mystery to me for a long time until I started receiving a number of photos from the early days of the camp. This is that Williamsburg style farmhouse that the newspaper article mentioned. And then here are 2 giant dead trees right next to the building that they used as the dining hall and administration building. They must have thought these were iconic enough to memorialize in the patch, because they did it. And the patch, this particular patch, was used for 3 or 4. Well, this general design was used for 3, 4, or 5 years after that. This is the new dining hall that they built in 1949. Pretty lackluster building made of concrete masonry units or cinder blocks. The caretaker's cottage, which was only demolished a few years ago, was occupied by 2 caretakers or rangers in particular. One was named Hawes Coleman, the other by a man named DP Pop Ottinger. Pop was a very beloved person in camp and at in the OA. One of his claims to fame is carving neckerchief slides. He carved many neckerchief slides for different events and as gifts to scouts and other things. As he kind of got more official about it, he created this brand here that says Pop, so you can identify carved slides that he did, usually by seeing this Pop brand. The troop campsite started out, this is a late 1940s, so they're using military pyramid tents with a wood frame. They started out this way and then started using more traditional wall tent, or traditional for us, wall tents slightly later. The camp patch would start to evolve a little bit, same basic design. They just started changing the color and tweaking it some. Trading post, This camp is built right after World War II. There was not a lot of money floating around, and the council spent a lot of money on the land. And so they used the most modern building materials that they could find that were as inexpensive as possible. And so that means a lot of the buildings were made of cinder block, which is not necessarily a romantic or rustic building material, but it got the job done and allowed them to go ahead and open camp. Waterfront looks pretty much like any scout camp waterfront, but it's a very nice sized lake that they ended up constructing. The parade field, you see the view of the Blue Ridge Mountains behind. Very, very nice setting. The gateway heading into camp. One thing that's kind of interesting is that you'll see here, if you can really squint and zoom in, it says posted Wildlife Refuge Boy Scout Reservation. The council created an actual official wildlife refuge there on that property. They conducted a number of conservation programs for wildlife and trees, pine trees and other things on the property. And interestingly, I've probably met a dozen former scouts who became foresters or conservationists or professors at universities because of what they learned at Camp Monacan through the conservation programs that they ran there. So it was a really neat thing that had a lasting effect on a lot of scouts. This neckerchief over here to the left, as far as I know, is the only one that was made. I think it was perhaps a prototype. The interesting thing about it is it's very, very similar to the first Koo-Koo-Kahoo Lodge neckerchiefs. Koo-Koo-Kahoo Lodge became the OA Lodge around 1952. The lodge changed its name, not the number, still stayed Lodge 161. But I think this neckerchief for Camp Monacan was ordered at the same time that the first lodge neckerchiefs were, because it's got the same ribbon border and the same embroidery style and all of that. Like many councils, the OA Lodge did a pageant on Friday night. This one was the Legend of the Monacan Indians. And it was obviously a prelude to the OA call out, tap out ceremony that they would do that night. Interestingly, the camp name, you might have, well, probably most of you wouldn't have noticed this at all, but the camp name is spelled M-O-N-O-C-A-N, which is not the proper spelling for the Monacan tribe. It should be M-O-N-A-C-A-N. As I interviewed one former scout who was involved in these ceremonies, he said he really wished that they had made more of an effort to communicate and learn from the local remnants of the Monacan tribe in the area, that they really missed an opportunity to do that. And they would have learned more, including how to properly spell the tribe's name. So this is a story that ends the same way for a lot of councils in the early 1970s. The baby boom began to bust. The number of scout age youth in the BSA declined pretty sharply in the late 1960s. Councils all around the country were, I'm sorry, there's a typo there, but they were encouraged to consider consolidation, and encourage that word can be used in different ways, but basically many councils consolidated. Camp Monacan itself was sold to developers, the developers of that wintergreen ski resort in the summer of 1971. And the Roanoke and Lynchburg councils, they merged in March of 1972. So without a camp, the camp operation shifted to the 15,000 acre scout reservation in Pulaski County, Virginia, which houses today Camps Powhatan and Atari. And I specifically show photos of Camp Atari because Atari, up until this point, had been a kind of a primitive troop-based camp. It didn't have a lot of facilities. It was really just a place where troops would go to do weekend activities or whatever. Because of the influx of scouts coming from the Lynchburg Council or from Piedmont Area Council in 1971-72, the they had to expand the offerings for summer camp on the Blue Ridge Scout Reservation, and Camp Powhatan needed some extra capacity. So at that point, they went ahead and built a dining hall, an administration building, and other buildings at Camp Atari to house those extra scouts. When I was growing up in the council, I did not realize that why so many of the troops in my area, I was from the Lynchburg area, why so many of those troops were so loyal to Camp Atari, not Powhatan, because I worked on Camp Powhatan staff, and that was the camp that I knew and loved more so than Atari. But it turns out that's because this is the camp that was created for many of those troops back in the early 1970s. And so the troops started, kind of built a relationship with Camp Atari. But because Camp Atari was expanded due to the influx of membership in the early 1970s, it also hasn't operated for the past couple of years because there hasn't been as much demand for camp. I just lost the word, for the capacity has outgrown the demand at this point. And so Atari is not operating as a full service summer camp at the moment, but you can start up again anytime that the council is ready. That is my presentation.